You know, when you get older, you start to think about the holidays differently. Christmas isn't just about the gifts or the decorations, it's about family. It's about gathering together, sharing meals, laughing over old stories, and feeling like you belong. At least, that's what I always believed. So when my own son told me I wasn't invited for Christmas this year, I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't just about missing dinner. It wasn't just about being left out. It was about everything I had given, everything I had sacrificed for him, being tossed aside like I didn't matter. And that's when I knew this Christmas wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. I guess I should start from the beginning. Because if you don't know the whole story, you might think I overreacted. But trust me, once you hear the full picture, you'll understand why my revenge was brutal, and why I don't regret a single thing. I raised my son on my own after his mother passed away. It wasn't easy. I worked long shifts, sometimes 2 jobs at once, just to make sure he had what he needed. I skipped out on vacations, nights out with friends, even opportunities for relationships, because everything I did for him. And I don't say that to get a pat on the back. I say it because when you give that much of yourself, you expect at least a little loyalty in return. Over the years, I made sure he had a good education, a safe home, and every chance to succeed. And when he finally bought his first house, I was proud. I really was, but the truth is, he wouldn't have managed it without me. I co-signed the mortgage, and when money got tight, I started covering the payments myself. Month after month, year after year, I kept him afloat, and he knew it. So, imagine my shock when 2 weeks before Christmas, I called to ask what time I should come over, because it had become a tradition that I'd spend Christmas Eve with him, his wife, and their kids, and he said, as casually as you like, "We weren't really expecting you this year." At first, I laughed. I thought maybe it was some kind of joke. But no, he doubled down. He said it would just be him, his wife, and the kids this time. "We're keeping it small," he said, like I was some outsider who didn't belong in my own family anymore. That was the moment. That was when I decided things were about to change. I hung up the phone that night feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I sat there in my living room, staring at the blinking Christmas lights I'd strung up out of habit, and the silence in the house felt heavier than ever. All I could hear was my son's voice echoing in my head. "We weren't really expecting you this year, not expecting me." What kind of son says that to his own father, especially after everything I'd done for him? I thought back to the countless Christmases when I'd gone all out just to make his day special. I'd worked overtime to afford the latest toys when he was a kid, even if it meant I couldn't buy myself a proper winter coat. I'd stayed up all night wrapping gifts so he'd wake up to the magic of Christmas morning. And when he got older and started his own family, I made sure the tradition continued. But suddenly, I was no longer part of the picture. Suddenly, I was disposable. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe his wife wanted a quiet holiday. Maybe the kids were sick. Maybe it wasn't personal. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was personal. Because you don't just forget to invite your father. You make that choice. You decide he's not worth the chair at the table. And that's when the bitterness started to build. Not just because of Christmas, but because of the years of unspoken entitlement I'd put up with. The way he always seemed to expect my help without ever truly appreciating it. The way he'd roll his eyes if I offered advice, like I was some outdated relic who didn't understand life anymore. The way he took and took while giving back so little. That's when the thought hit me. Why was I still paying for his house? Why was I bending over backward for someone who couldn't even bother to open his door to me for the holidays? I'll be honest, the idea of pulling the plug on the mortgage payments gave me a rush I hadn't felt in years. A spark of control. A sense that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally learn what it felt like to be left out in the cold. But I didn't act right away. Oh no, that would have been too easy. Instead, I let the days tick by, pretending everything was fine. When he texted me some half-hearted Merry Christmas on the day itself, I didn't respond. I just sat there with my glass of whiskey, imagining the smug little smile on his face as he sat down to dinner without me. And that's when I promised myself next year he wouldn't be smiling. See, revenge isn't about lashing out in the moment. It's about patience, timing. It's about waiting until the knife cuts the deepest. And my son was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The funny thing about betrayal is that once you see it, you start noticing all the cracks that were always there. Over the next few weeks, I began piecing together all the little ways my son had been taking advantage of me. There were the mortgage payments, of course. He never even asked how I was doing financially, just assumed I'd keep covering it, month after month. Then there were the little loans that never got paid back. The dinners where he'd conveniently forget his wallet. The times I'd show up with groceries because his fridge was empty. The babysitting requests that were less about family bonding and more about free childcare. And suddenly, I realized I had created this. I had raised a man who thought of me not as a father, but as a safety net. One evening, I dropped by his house unannounced. I wanted to test the waters, see if he'd even let me in. His wife opened the door, gave me a tight smile, and said, "Oh, we didn't know you were coming." The way she said it, you'd think I was a door-to-door salesman instead of family. I sat in their living room for maybe 15 minutes, long enough to see that my grandkids barely remembered I existed. They were polite, but distant, like I was just some acquaintance. That night, I drove home with my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. The truth was unavoidable now. I was no longer part of their lives. Not really. I was just the invisible hand that made sure their bills were paid on time. And that's when the anger transformed into resolve. The next day, I called the bank. I had them remove my auto-pay setup for the mortgage. The woman on the other end hesitated, almost like she wanted to confirm. "Sir, are you sure about this?" "Oh, I was sure. See, here's the thing about people who take you for granted. They don't notice your presence until you remove it. And once the payments stopped, it didn't take long for the panic to set in." 3 weeks later, my son called me, not to check in, not to apologize, just to say, "Hey Dad, I think there's been some kind of mix-up with the mortgage. The bank says they haven't received payment." And that, right there, that was the hook I'd been waiting for. I played dumb at first. That's strange. Maybe you should look into it. I could practically hear the sweat forming on his forehead through the phone. He stammered, "Well, yeah, but you're still handling it, right?" I let the silence stretch. Then I said, slowly, carefully, "Not anymore." He didn't know what to say. For the first time in his life, my son didn't have a ready-made response. I could feel the ground shifting beneath him, just like it had for me on that cold December night. Oh, that was still to come. The silence on the phone that day was almost sweeter than any Christmas carol I'd ever heard. My son, usually so quick with excuses, so full of confidence, suddenly didn't know how to respond. Finally, he managed. "What do you mean, not anymore?" I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of my words sink in. "I mean, I'm done paying your bills, son. You're a grown man with a family. It's time you handled it yourself." He tried to laugh it off, but there was a tremor in his voice. "Dad, come on. You know I can't afford that on my own right now." And there it was, the truth laid bare. All this time, his life had been propped up by me, his house, his image of stability. Even the roof over his children's heads was all built on the back of my sacrifices. I didn't say much else that night, just hung up after a quiet, "good luck." But inside, something in me shifted. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand, and I wasn't going to let it go easily. The weeks that followed were interesting. At first, he called constantly. Messages, voicemails, even texts from his wife, asking me to just be reasonable. I thought back to Christmas Eve, sitting alone with a plate of leftovers, while my own son laughed around a table I wasn't welcome at. Tell me again about being reasonable. When the second missed payment notice came, he showed up at my door. No warning, just pounding on the frame until I answered. His face was pale, eyes wide with panic. "Dad, please, you don't understand. We could lose the house." I let him in, but I didn't soften. "Funny," I said. "You didn't seem to mind when I was the one losing out, losing Christmas, losing my family, losing respect. Maybe now you know how that feels." He dropped into a chair, head in his hands. For a moment, I almost felt a pang of guilt. Almost. But then, I remembered his words. "We weren't really expecting you this year." And just like that, the guilt vanished. See? Watching them finally understand the consequences of their choices. And oh, my son was beginning to understand, but I wasn't finished. Not yet. Because I had one final move to make. One that would ensure he never forgot what it meant to push me out of his life. The panic in his eyes when I told him I'd stopped paying felt like vindication and heartbreak rolled into one. He clawed at air for answers, for something to steady him, but there wasn't anything to grab. He had to face the fallout with his own two hands. For a week, he tried everything, calling his bank, begging his boss for overtime, selling bits of anything he could pawn. He even called his sister, who lived 2 towns over, but she told him bluntly she couldn't help. "You built this, Tom," she said. "You need to own it." The sting of her words was pure, and I heard it through the phone. It was exactly what I wanted him to hear. He did what most people do when pride and options run out. He started to bend. He came around more, awkward at first, offering half apologies between frantic plans and late-night sighs. He invited me to a coffee one morning, just the two of us, saying he wanted to talk things over. I went. Sitting across from him in that little cafe we used to frequent when he was a teenager, and I was teaching him to budget his pocket money. The place smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon, comforting, like a memory with a soft edge. He kept fidgeting with his spoon. I messed up. I shouldn't have said that. Christmas got complicated. I didn't mean it. The apology landed like a cheap coat, thin and poorly stitched. I could see the genuine regret behind it, sure, but I also felt the manipulative habit I'd spent a lifetime tolerating. He wanted the apology to wash everything clean. He wanted the narrative to go back to the way it was, me paying for their comfort, him eating up the benefit. I looked at him and I remembered other apologies. The time he promised to return alone and never did. The time he promised he'd be home for Mum's birthday and never showed. He'd said sorry before. He meant parts of it, but never the root. So I said nothing at first. I let the coffee cool. I let him fill the silence with explanations and justifications. And then I leaned in, low enough so only he could hear me. Tom, I said, an apology doesn't fix a habit. It doesn't fix a pattern. If you want things to be different, you have to do the proper work. You have to pay back what you owe, not just to me, but to yourself. He swallowed. He promised he would. He promised to start a repayment plan. He promised to be better. I left the cafe with a small, quiet satisfaction, thinking maybe this was the turning point, the place where the scales finally balanced. But you know how stories like this usually go. Promises are cheap currency. He started well enough, transferring what he said he could afford. It was a drop in a bucket, but it felt meaningful. Then life intervened. Car repairs, a broken boiler, an unexpected business expense. I watched the rhythm I'd created for him falter, and with each missed payment, it became clearer that he was not ready to stand on his own. He was like a man learning to walk on someone else's legs. He'd trip, fall, and expect the same steady hands to pick him up. That's when the uglier part of me took over, not the part that wanted to ruin him, but the part that wanted him to learn in a way that wouldn't let him forget. I started to be less available. I stopped answering his calls quickly. I let messages sit. I kept him waiting at my door when he came to see me in a panic. I wouldn't bail him out of every small crisis. The first few times he tried to lean on me, I just stared back, unhelpful and unyielding. It was like teaching a stubborn dog a new trick: you ignore the old behavior until the new one takes root. One evening, after a particularly heated exchange about whether he should sell some of his tools or downsize to a cheaper flat, he lost it. "You raised me to be weak," he shouted in the kitchen where his wife could hear. "You made everything too easy. You never let me fail." His wife intervened, pulling him back, telling him not to be cruel. But the words hit me worse than anything because they were half-true. I had smoothed his path. I had made it less likely he'd fall. I did that out of love, of course. But love with no boundaries becomes permission to take without thought. I'd created a safety net that had turned into a hammock, and now he lounged in it while pointing out the flaws of the person who built the ropes. So I tightened the ropes. I told him calmly that if he sold the family heirlooms, bits of his mother's jewelry, the old record player that meant a lot to him when he was a boy, then he shouldn't expect much from me. It was a gamble. I knew those things held sentimental value. I knew they'd be the last things he'd part with. But I also knew he had to feel the loss of comfort to appreciate the value of giving and respecting. He looked crushed. He looked cornered. But somewhere in the scramble, something shifted. He started to reach out to other people, not me, for help. He took on a second job. He started speaking to a financial advisor. He began to cut back, seriously. And as I watched him move, clumsy but determined, something softened in me. Revenge had been one part of my plan, yes. But this change was the thing I'd wanted most from the start. Responsibility. Yet the world had a way of complicating even the most quietly constructed lessons. One snowy week in December, with frost painting the window panes and a biting wind that felt like an old accusation, his mortgage lender flagged the account for repossession proceedings. A letter arrived with bureaucratic finality. Missed payments. Cure. Period over. Next steps. He called, voice breaking. I could hear the fear, the sickening knowledge that promises and new jobs wouldn't untangle this fast enough. I remember thinking, in that exact, still moment, of all the Christmases I'd spent working double shifts to put gifts under his tree, I remembered my wife humming carols as we wrapped presents. I thought about the tiny socks I'd folded with meticulous care. I thought about the man I'd raised, who was now on the verge of losing everything I'd helped him hold together. And I made a choice not to go back to being the bank, not to erase the lesson, but to play the hand with a little more mercy. I called the lender. That in itself was a small thrill, the taste of control, and the chance to tip the scales in a way that would teach him and still keep disaster from swallowing his kids. I asked about options, forbearance, payment plans, anything that would buy them time without erasing the accountability I'd insisted upon. The representative was helpful, offering a sympathetic tone and some bureaucracy-laced hope. We drafted a revised repayment program. I agreed to contribute a lump sum if he committed to the plan, and if his wife signed an agreement acknowledging the new household budget. It was conditional, deliberate, no clean resets, no going back to the old dynamic. When I rang Tom after arranging it, then he cried, not theatrical sobs, but the deep, shuddering releases of someone who realizes their scaffold has been removed and they're now required to climb. He said thank you over and over, but it was spammed with shame. He asked how to repay me. I told him the terms, monthly, realistic, with interest if necessary, and I watched him decide to accept them. That acceptance was the point where I felt the victory. He wasn't humiliated into obedience. He was learning the currency of consequences. Christmas came round again the following year. The house was smaller than the one he'd once had when I'd kept the mortgage. They'd taken a cheaper flat while the repayment plan ran its course. They had fewer presents under the tree, but there was something else that glittered in the room that no wrapping paper could replicate. The sound of him apologizing to his eldest for being distant the previous year. The way he stayed to help decorate instead of rushing off to a second job. The slow reweaving of family ties with earnestness rather than obligation. I wasn't there that Christmas. He'd invited me, genuinely this time, my place at the table no longer presumed but earned. I went, because what good is a revenge story that doesn't close on reconciliation? If that's what you want, tanned because I wanted to see if the man I'd raised could carry the lesson through. He greeted me at the door with something like humility and a handshake that felt like a peace offering. He made me tea proper, strong tea, like my mother used to make hand. We sat in the living room with the kids sprawled on the floor, content with cheap toys and sticky fingers. There were awkward moments. Old arguments slipped out like loose threads when some trivial stress arose, a misplaced bill, a moan about petrol. But the threads were mended quicker now, with apologies and adjustments instead of excuses. He still rang me sometimes when he was stuck, but the requests were framed differently. "Dad, can you advise me?" rather than "Dad, will you pay?" He'd learned to ask for help rather than demand support. That, to me, was the real revenge, not the moment of discomfort, but the lasting shift that made the discomfort a teacher rather than a wound. And yet, I won't pretend it was all nobility. There were nights I lay awake and wondered if I'd been cruel, if I'd pushed too far. I thought about the look on my daughter-in-law's face the night Rudd's had to pawn her grandmother's brooch to feed the kids for a week. I thought about the shame my son wore like a second skin for months. Those were heavy things to bear, even if they led to growth. Revenge is a complex cocktail, sweet at the first sip and bitter by the final swallow. People ask me sometimes if I regret what I did. They want a simple answer, yes or no. The truth is, I don't regret that I stood up for myself, that I demanded respect rather than continued invisibility. I don't regret showing him that security without responsibility breeds dependence. But I also hold the memory of the harder moments like a bruise, the worry lines, the tight conversations, the quiet apologies made in the dark. If I had to do it all over again, would I choose the exact same moves? Maybe not. Maybe I'd find firmer ways to teach without the threat of a house over their heads. Maybe I'd draw boundaries earlier before the habit of dependence calcified into entitlement. Still, when I sit in my armchair by the window and watch the December frost lace the world, I think of that Christmas of a gaggle of children laughing around a modest tree, their father present and trying, their mother smiling with relief. I think about my son, who now owns the consequences of his choices and, for all his faults, tries harder. There's a strange pride in that. It's not the pride of victory over another, but the pride of seeing a tough lesson take root and watching someone grow because of it. So was my revenge brutal. Maybe it had to be felt, not just heard about. But it wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was tough love carved with stubborn hands. And in the end, the thing I wanted most, the thing that tugged at every sacrifice I'd made, wasn't to punish him forever. It was to be invited back, not because I kept the checkbook, but because I was wanted. That invitation, earned and sincere, tasted sweeter than any petty triumph. The following year rolled in faster than I expected, and with it came another Christmas. But this one was different. My son had learned the weight of carrying his own life, and though his shoulders weren't always strong enough, he carried it anyway. He didn't hide from me anymore. He didn't duck calls. He didn't make excuses. He invited me openly, and this time, it wasn't an obligation, it was family. When I walked through his front door that Christmas Eve, the house was smaller, yes. The decorations weren't as extravagant, the tree a little sparse, and the gifts under it fewer. But the warmth in the room, that was richer than it had ever been. My grandchildren rushed to me, arms wide, shouting, "Granddad," with genuine joy, not awkward politeness. His wife hugged me, and I could feel in that hug something unspoken, a thank you. Not for money or favors, but for standing firm when it mattered. We sat down to dinner, and for the first time in years, my son gave a toast. He raised his glass. his hand trembling just a little, and said, "To Dad, for teaching me the hardest lesson I've ever learned, and for not giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve a seat at this table." The room went quiet. My throat tightened, and for a second I couldn't speak. Then I lifted my own glass and simply said, "To family, and to never forgetting what it means to fight for each other." The kids cheered, glasses clinked, and the tension that had weighed us down for so long finally melted into laughter. Still, in the quiet moments later that night, after the dishes were washed and the children tucked into bed, my son pulled me aside. He looked me in the eye, not with arrogance, not with entitlement, but with honesty, and said, "Dad, I was wrong. I was selfish. You didn't deserve the way I treated you. And I know I can't undo the past, but I can do better now." And for the first time, I believed him. The truth is, revenge isn't always about destroying someone. Sometimes it's about forcing them to face the mirror, to reckon with the choices they've made, and to grow from them. My revenge had been brutal, yes, but it hadn't been heartless. It had been a wake-up call, and maybe, just maybe, it saved our family. So now, every Christmas, when I sit at that table and hear the sound of my grandchildren's laughter, I remember the year I spent alone, staring at blinking lights and an empty chair. I remember the bitterness, the anger, the fire that fueled my revenge. And I also remember the lesson it left behind, that sometimes the cruelest kindness is the one that forces someone you love to finally stand on their own 2 feet. So, to anyone listening who's ever been cast aside, who's ever felt uninvited, unwanted, unseen, remember this: you don't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes the quietest, most brutal revenge is simply walking away and letting people feel the weight of what life is without you. And if they come back, if they finally see you, respect you, and fight to have you in their lives, then maybe, just maybe, it was all worth it. So, tell me, what would you have done? Would you have walked away for good, or would you have given them one more chance? I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around, because, trust me, there are plenty more revenge stories where this one came from.